One of the key elements of the Zettelkasten note-taking method is to create your literature notes. Now, these notes are your atomic ideas, your understanding of the source material that you've been reading. So if I'm reading a Kindle book, for example, or watching a YouTube video, I might make fleeting notes. These are the quick catches, whether it's a highlight, a quote from the material, or just the ideas that they spark in the moment. And I'm condensing down that information as fleeting notes. Then, now I want to rebuild that understanding, rebuild those notes as literature notes. And the key essence of this is that they're written in my words. So they go through my process of thinking, and I get to evaluate it in its true form based on that source material. And then later on, you would take those into your permanent notes where you start considering that in the wider context of your whole Zettelkasten. So all the books that you've read and all the videos you watch, you kind of bring it all together and link them together. But today, I'm going to be demonstrating my process of taking my fleeting notes from my Kindle highlights and showcasing what I do in rebuilding my literature notes. And I've got a book here. So the book I've read is Critical Thinking in a Nutshell. So it's an area of interest for me to understand, how to reason about things, how to think critically. So I've read this book, and the way I do it is as I'm reading it, whether that's on my phone or on my tablet, I'm using the Kindle app, and then I will highlight sections that mean something to me. And then when I do that, I will create an annotation. Well, not always, but sometimes I'll create an annotation of the idea that it sparks. And that could be a question. It could be an analogy where I'm comparing that to something else in my life or something that I've observed elsewhere. Or it could just be something completely fleeting, something completely different, where somehow an idea popped into my head that may not even be related to that text. So I get that down into the Kindle notes. Now, to export these notes, we can do that using the Kindle app, Kindle desktop app. And what we want to do is we want to save this in a format that we can bring into our note-taking system. So this is obviously not always the easiest thing to do. Some books do limit what you can export. This particular book allows me to export 100% of the book, which is quite nice. And I've apparently reached 14%, which seems quite high, but I guess that's what it does. So I'm just going to put on the desktop here, Critical Thinking in a Nutshell, and we'll see what that has produced. So if I minimize this and bring up my Finder and go to my desktop and look for the Critical Thinking, it's a web page. So let's just open that up over here. So what this has done is it's very kind of crudely exported the highlights, the page locations, and any comments that I have made along the way. So somewhere in here, there'll be my annotations as well as the highlights. Now, what I want to do is get this in a format now that I can start doing something with it. And very crudely, I'm going to just copy all the text. I'll just do Control A, Control C, and in Flowtelic here, I've got a collection called Literature Notes. This is just for this demo, and I will create a new study note here, and I'll call it Critical Thinking in a Nutshell. And I'm just going to paste in all those highlights, and it will sort of preserve some of the formatting. It's not brilliant, but it's workable for what we want to do. And now I can pin this note to the sidebar panel. So when I show my pin notes, I now have that there, and double click just to expand it out. Okay, now that I have that, I can now start going into my study notes here and essentially just start creating what is going to become my literature notes from this over here. So we can go new study note, and we can start now evaluating the contents. Now, I might want to use this, or I might want to go back to using the Kindle app, where essentially it's formatted in a way that I can click on these and actually get some context around the text there. So depending on the workflow that I want in particular, I may choose to do that. But for now, I'm just going to see how far I can get just using the highlights and the copied text, and see if I can kind of rebuild my understanding. It's been a while since I read this book, so I'm going to be relying on the fact that I do remember what the book entailed. So it's about critical thinking. So one of the challenges is how to create these atomic notes. So I've got a comment here, a highlight here that says, you do not have the time or energy to challenge the status quo. And what that means in the context is that when you're discussing things, when you're in the flow of conversation, people will use certain narratives of how something should be, which is sort of the consensus, the status quo. And then you end up arguing about something completely different and sort of deviating away from the thing that you want to get to. So we'll create a note called the status quo and critical thinking. And here I just want to capture that thought, that understanding. So when in a discussion, I will correct the spelling as I go like this. So when in a discussion, you may be faced with someone not wanting to move from the status quo of a topic. To help open up their mind, you may be faced to challenge the status quo. However, in doing so, you start to expend, is that a word? Expend energy, time and energy to do this. This can be distracting and makes it harder for you to sustain the conversation to the point that is relevant to you. So something along those lines. I would probably spend a little bit more time on this note in particular because that's quite complicated. However, I think it's a good start for what we have. And I want to rename this note now that I've got my thinking in place, the energy of challenging the status quo. And I'll write it like that. Okay. I would probably tag this under critical thinking just so I know, but for the purpose of this video, all the notes in here will be related to critical thinking. Okay, next one. You know you will face opposition from other people. So this is in the context that when you start using critical thinking in conversing in dialogue, that other people, they generally don't always want to have that dialogue. They don't want to explore the root understanding of things. They have their position, they have their understanding. So even before you start dialogue, that you now have to equate, will I be facing a challenge? You know, will people be pushing back? So I'm going to relate this note to the idea of when to consider critical thinking in dialogue. And I'm going to create this new study note. And so when evaluating a good time to conduct critical thinking, you have to consider the following. And I'm just going to drop in now this idea here that will the other person be open to discussion, or will they give you opposition? So, and this is a note now that I can keep evolving of as I go through the text. There may be some other things in here that are quite useful to put in. Okay, so we're back over here, and then we've got a link to that. Next one here is, so therefore, you end up making a solid plan, but one which will not make too many waves or provide the necessary change. So this is all about compromising your end goal based on these challenges. So I'm going to add this here. So compromises made when engaging in critical thinking dialogue, because it involves. And before I do that, if I can engaging. So before I create the note, I'll fix the spelling. Okay, so here we have a trade-off. So the trade-off of engaging in critical thinking is that you may not want to create too many waves in how other people think about the topic. In doing this, you may compromise your desired results by limiting the scope of what can be discussed. Okay, so nice little atomic note there. Depending on who you're working with, who you're discussing with, may result in you having to tailor back, scale down what you want to achieve. Okay, next one. So the skills honed in critical thought will give you the foresight to predict and prepare in advance for time-wasting problems. Nothing saves more time than getting things right first time. So what this is really doing is highlighting why critical thinking, the preparation and the practice of it is quite useful. So let's create a study note here, and we'll say benefits of critical thinking skills by learning how to approach and improve, or how to improve your critical thinking skills. And then I'm just going to do a list here. Avoid wasting time. Now, why do you avoid wasting time? Because, actually, I'll keep this as a full sentence. You can avoid wasting time because you have the foresight that allows you to predict what your, I don't want to use the word opponent, but I will use that. Opponent will say, giving you an opportunity to better prepare in advance. Okay, there we go. Next one. Critical thinking is about making informed, considered decisions to minimize the risk of making bad decisions. So we're talking about critical thinking and decision making. So critical thinking is a valuable skill, as it can help you make better informed decisions and potentially avoid costly bad decisions. Okay, so if I was reading this now back, I'd be like, okay, great. But how does it do it? So this is where I want to create a C also, and we want to start bringing in any other notes, which I don't think I actually have those notes as of yet to achieve that. So let's move on for the moment. So therefore you end up making a solid plan, one of which will not make waves. It's a critical skill to have the foresight. It's about making informed and considered decisions. instead of bad decisions. Okay, so what is critical thinking? So Socrates has taught many of the youngest and brightest to question all assumptions. So let's create a reference here to Socrates. Off the top of my head, I couldn't recall too much, but I will say, just capture that. He taught how to question all assumptions. We'll leave it at that for the moment. That's something I could flesh out more once I have more context around that. There are those who don't like the questioning nature. Is that because it threatens their power, or their belief system is overriding to desire to have discourse in the subject? So this is a note I've added. That's why it doesn't read very well, because I was doing it on my phone. So here, as I'm reading the text, I made an observation, and I started to question, why do people not like critical thinking? So why critical thinking may be opposed, and there may be a range of reasons why people are opposed to critical thinking. Some of these can be down to it challenging their power. I'd say their position of power. Position of power, or their belief system. If I were to bring in some psychology here, it may actually result in them not realizing that they're being adverse to it, because their brain is protecting them in some way. So what I want to do here is see also. I've got this thought. I don't have enough information to give the context around that, to give the solid evidence to that, but I will create a question, and it will be, does the brain protect itself, by finding ways to oppose critical thinking? Okay, so I can just create that as a note that I need to, let's say, to do something for me to come back to at some point. But it's opened up a question that I could start looking at other texts. I've recently read the book The Scout Mindset, and that seems to align its thinking with how to look at things more critically, and what's going on potentially in the brain that's sort of protecting itself from there. So more research is needed there. Socrates told his students to examine every idea on its merits alone. So we're just going to create a evaluating ideas. So it's important to evaluate ideas on its merit alone, because in doing so you can help remove any bias that you may inherently have. There's a great, I can't remember the where it's from, but it's a really great quote. I can't spell inherently. Inherently, is it? So I just want to capture this because I know the quote, and it's I'll create that as I'll just do all the study notes for now. So two opposing ideas. I'll put it in quotes here, and it's something to the effect of like a true sign of intelligence is to be able to hold two contradictory ideas in your head at once and still function. something along those lines. The actual quote is different to that, but the concept here is when you're evaluating ideas on their merits alone, it's really important to be able to challenge the things that don't feel right for you. So you've got to hold a contradictory idea. You've got to know that I may have my own belief system around here. I may have my own views, but to evaluate the ideas in their merits alone, I have to be able to put those to one side and get to the understanding from this other thing. I've got to evaluate this thing on its merit alone, and only later do I start to evaluate it in the context of things that I know previously. If you don't do that, you start skipping. You start having the bias in there. So one thing to note here, and I'm not doing it at this stage, but I really, as I start vocalizing these thoughts, these are new ideas. These are new things I really should be putting into the Zettelkasten. And as I articulate them, speaking to you over this recording, I'm processing my thinking, and that are things that I can put into my notes here. So this is to give you a bit of a rough idea of like how I would approach taking a book that I've read, and I would go through this. I would have to break it over multiple sessions, obviously. I would go through this. I'd start repeating back my understanding as though I'm talking to someone else. In fact, doing it to camera is really, really great because I have to speak clearly. I have to take an idea, write it in a certain way, and then retell it in a simpler way. And what I should be doing is going through all these notes again and start reducing them down into their simplest form so that it's really captured. And one thing I would also look at doing here is actually start organising my thinking together. So maybe I could create an index note called critical thinking, and just start thinking like, okay, I've got these study notes, and so let's say I start putting them into here as an outline. And once I get a more complete view of this, I can reorganize it. I can start putting some hierarchy back in and look at where the relationships and the groupings are and where one thing links to another. So I might have, what is critical thinking? So I might put that in there. And the book that I've just read will also kind of have this structure naturally, but sometimes they'll explain things that sort of jump around the concepts and the ideas you have, may sort of pull yourself out of that chapter and maybe talk about something that's covered later on. So you have to rebuild your own map of content, your own way of looking at this. So I would say, like here, I'd say challenges, and I put why critical thinking may be opposed. So if I put that there, what is critical thinking? I probably wouldn't put that in there, and then I'd probably have a section called questions where I put I did have a question in there. So does the brain protect itself? So now I've got this map here, and I can start to evaluate that and build up this, and that becomes my understanding now of everything out of that book. I've pulled that information out of the book and I've organized it in. I've put them in its own collection. I could do that in the main collection. If you're using different software, you can put it in a subfolder for those literature notes to exist. The important thing is everything that surrounds this is from this one book, and then later I would start putting that into my main Zettelkasten, where I can start reading those notes, saying, is it something I've covered already? Is it something that links to an existing note? Does it oppose something I've said before? Where does it slot in? And maybe I've got maps of content then in my main Zettelkasten where I can start copying these notes in and building those in and layering them into the bigger picture. So I just wanted to show an example of how I go through my Kindle notes, but more importantly, how I actually approach the text. So I've used a book in particular to really highlight my thought process. I've read the book, and it's been a while since I've read the book, so the freshness of the content is certainly not there at the moment. But I'm relying on those notes. I can obviously go back to the Kindle and, if it doesn't make sense, get a wider view of it. What would I do differently if I had more time with this? I would probably make a note where in the book I picked up those ideas from, just so I can keep those references. An example could be going through not that one, but evaluating ideas. I had it in here, didn't I? Or did I? No, I just named it evaluating, I think. So do not have time to challenge. That's probably one of the earlier ones. So the energy. So I would probably put a reference here. And then what I would do is create a book reference. So critical thinking in a nutshell. So let's say if I open that, I would probably actually call this a book. So those are my notes out of the book, for example. There's different ways of organising this. I would have that reference, and then I could essentially put something like that. And that way I know I can get back. As I use this tool here, which is Flowtelic, which is the app that I'm building, essentially what I'm doing is using the app in the best way possible, finding its limitations, and now I'm going back and thinking, what would make this software even easier, better? And a couple of things that come to mind. So it gives you a bit of a mindset where I'm going with the app is obviously creating notes in its own collection per book is probably not the right thing. I want to make that a thing within your bigger project, within your bigger collection. So you can group everything down into its individual kind of literature notes, but also the referencing from over here into here. I want that to be more automatic. I want these to be broken down into little blocks that I can tick off as I go, so I know how far through that book I am. So these are the ideas I want. I want to make the idea of taking a book and just progressing through it bit by bit. Build that into the focus mode area of the app, so that my study session, I chip away at making either reading the book, or I chip away at organising them into my literature notes. And these are the ideas I'm thinking. The app is certainly not there yet. Lots of work that needs to be done on it. But the more I try and teach the Zettelkasten method, the more I realise where the gaps are in what the software does today. And this is all software versus what the future could look like. And I think that's really exciting. So if you are interested in following the Flowtelic journey, then go over to join.flowtelic.com, and there you can just drop your email in, join the waitlist. It's an aspirational project. It's a long-term project. I'm working on it, but you get, it could be fun as new releases will get published. So yeah, there we go. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you're interested in the Zettelkasten side of things more, I'm writing a book on that. And if you go to atomicnotetaking.com, there you'll find details about the book, and that will help you go basically all the missing things I had from my learning of the Zettelkasten. These are things I'm consolidating down, all the teaching that I've done so far. I'm taking that feedback and I'm trying to put it into one package that essentially removes the trial and error, and not necessarily tells you exactly how to do things, but gives you that moment of like, aha, I understand the essence of it. I understand the framework. I understand how now to approach the challenge that I may have, whether I'm studying for a PhD or whether I'm just doing it as my knowledge is my garden. You're just going through and enjoying it. So whichever angle you're coming at, I hope it's got something to help give you that mindset of being able to tackle your kind of Zettelkasten journey. So there we go. Thank you very much.